The Enterprise D moved through open space with the quiet confidence of a vessel that had seen wonders without being consumed by them. Stars slid past the main view screen in steady silence, distant and orderly, every point of light a reminder that the galaxy still followed rules most days. On the bridge, the rhythm of duty held. Conversations were low, instruments hummed, and the ship's presence felt like a calm mind in a vast, dark sea. Captain Picard sat centered in that calm, hands resting lightly on the chair arms, gaze drifting between the screen and the subtle choreography of his crew. There was comfort in routine, not because routine was dull, but because it meant the universe, at least for the moment, was not demanding sacrifice. The Enterprise was built for the unknown, yet even the unknown came in seasons. This hour belonged to peace. Then the long-range sensors changed their tone. A shift in the bridge atmosphere arrived before any words did, a silent tightening that moved through the crew like a breeze before a storm. Data's head lifted slightly, fingers pausing above the console as new readings spilled across the display. The numbers did not fit any pattern the ship's database recognized. Subspace remained stable, gravitational fields held normal, and yet something in the fabric of space was failing in a way that was not failure at all. Picard felt the difference in the way one feels a wrong note in familiar music. Not loud, not immediate, but unmistakable once heard. The view screen adjusted to the coordinates as if drawn by a quiet instinct, and the stars there began to warp. At first it looked like heat distortion, a shimmer that could be dismissed as sensor error, until the shimmer hardened into a line. Space was splitting. Not folding into a wormhole, not tearing like a subspace rupture, not collapsing into any known geometry. This was a clean fracture, the way glass yields to pressure when the laws holding it together are suddenly rewritten. The edges of the wound held colors that should not exist in normal spacetime, thin veins of crimson and pale gold flickering in patterns too deliberate to be random. For a moment, the captain watched without speaking, absorbing the impossible with the discipline of someone who had learned that wonder and danger often arrive wearing the same face. The ship's hull gave a faint groan, not from impact, but from stress in the electromagnetic field surrounding the breach. Consoles registered a rising magnetic gradient strong enough to tug at the Enterprise's own metal skeleton. It was subtle, almost gentle, but it carried a promise of escalation, the kind that begins as a whisper and ends as a storm. Picard's mind moved through first contact protocols, threat assessments, and the older instinct beneath both, the one that carried the weight of every encounter with the unknown. Whatever this was, it did not belong to his centuries' understanding of reality. The tear held in tension, as if the universe itself had turned and decided to open a door it had kept sealed for millennia. With calm certainty, the thought came steady and low through the captain's awareness, a simple recognition shaped by experience rather than fear. Something worse than the known had appeared, and the Enterprise had arrived in time to witness the first breath of it. The bridge waited on that breath, poised between curiosity and caution, as the fracture widened by another silent inch, and the stars around it seemed to lean away. The moment stretched, soft and ominous, handing the ship forward into whatever would come through next. Picard rose from the chair with the measured control of a man who refused to let surprise become panic. The fracture on the view screen continued to widen in slow, deliberate strokes, and the captain could feel the bridge leaning toward a future none of them could yet name. His voice carried across the room without strain, low and even, the way command should sound when reality turns uncertain. "Shields up, red alert." The ship answered immediately. Lights shifted from calm white to deep crimson, and the quiet hum of routine became the sharper pulse of readiness. Consoles brightened, stations tightened into purpose. Around him, the bridge crew moved with practiced precision, each action part of a language learned through years of crisis and survival. Picard watched that language unfold and felt a private steadiness in it. Whatever the universe had opened, the Enterprise would meet it awake. Data's hands went fluid over the operations interface, each motion exact, each calculation stacking into towers of possibility that still refused to resolve. The android's gaze remained fixed, almost reverent, as though the tier were a riddle the cosmos had written directly for him. Sensor returns are inconsistent. His report came calm and fast. Subspace readings stable, gravitational shear minimal, yet dimensional cohesion is degrading. The fracture is not behaving like any known spatial phenomenon. Across the bridge, Geordi leaned toward his console, visor catching the shifting light from the screen. The patterns rolling off the breach were not random bursts but structured waves, rising and falling like a pulse with intent behind it. He rooted power, cross-checked harmonics, and watched the ship's own electromagnetic field begin to tremble under pressure it was never designed to face. "There's a storm forming around it," he said, the words coming with controlled disbelief, electromagnetic intensity climbing past safe limits. It's like the space around that tier is turning into a magnetosphere of its own. Worf's posture hardened at tactical. His instincts did not need the numbers to tell him something was wrong. The Klingon's eyes tracked the breach as if it were a living adversary. Magnetic turbulence increasing in concentric rings, he reported, steady and severe. If the gradient continues rising, it could begin to strip power directly from our systems, or worse, destabilize the hull's structural integrity. Picard listened, and beneath the discipline of command felt the quiet weight of escalation settling onto his shoulders. A storm born from a wound in spacetime, a field that bent metal and law alike, and a breach that moved with the patience of something that expected to be obeyed. The captain's mind measured risk, but his deeper sense measured meaning. This was not merely an anomaly to analyze. It was an event, the kind that rewrote the day it touched. The Enterprise held its red-lit breath, shields rising like a second skin around the ship, while the storm thickened around the tier in slow, violent spirals. Picard kept his gaze on the fracture, feeling the bridge and crew steady behind him, and sensing that the next few minutes would decide whether this was the beginning of contact or the beginning of war. The air seemed to tighten, handing them softly forward into whatever the storm was preparing to deliver. The fracture did not rush. It widened with a strange patience, as if space itself were taking careful breaths. On the main view screen, the thin line that had first appeared now stretched into a jagged opening, its edges sharp and glass-like, reflecting no starlight yet radiating a bruised glow of its own. The surrounding stars bent away from it, not pulled by gravity, but repelled by something that felt like lawlessness. The Enterprise hung at the edge of understanding, shields flaring in layered harmonics while the storm around the tier thickened. Electromagnetic turbulence rolled outward in quiet waves. The ship's sensors rendered the storm as nested spirals of color, each ring more intense than the last. Currents surged through vacuum the way weather moved through air, creating a false sky around the wound. Metallic panels across the bridge registered faint vibrational tremors, and somewhere in the ship's bones a low groan traveled, not of fear but of strain. It was the sound of a structure meeting forces that had no place in its engineering. Picard stood motionless before the view screen, letting the moment settle. There was a discipline to witnessing the unknown without forcing a conclusion too quickly. A captain's instinct demanded action, but wisdom demanded clarity, and clarity demanded patience. The fracture's geometry did not resemble any known subspace topology. It looked like a cut, clean and deliberate, the kind made by something that had wanted a doorway rather than a rupture. That intention lingered in the air of the bridge like a presence unseen. Data continued to feed probabilities into the ship's computers, each model collapsing into contradiction. The storm's signature spiked along the electromagnetic spectrum, then vanished, then returned with a different rhythm, as if some hidden hand were tuning it in real time. Geordi routed auxiliary power to stabilize field integrity, watching the deflector dish answer like a heartbeat under pressure. Worf kept tactical readings locked, jaw tight, sensing a threat too alien for instinct to name. The crew moved as one organism around a wound, that felt too quiet to be natural. Then the colors at the rim of the tier began to change. Crimson deepened toward black, gold sharpened toward white, and the patterns along the edge grew more complex. For a moment, shapes flickered there that did not belong to Federation databanks. Not symbols in any known language, but impressions of structure, like the memory of an architecture older than stars. The effect was subtle enough that an untrained eye might have missed it, yet the bridge felt it, a shared awareness that something was about to cross a boundary the universe rarely opened. The storm surged again. A pulse traveled outward and kissed the Enterprise's shields, and the ship's field shuddered as if struck by a silent wave. Consoles sparked with small errors, quickly corrected, yet the system logs marked the moment as a warning. The fracture was not only widening, it was strengthening. Whatever force sustained it had found stability, and stability suggested purpose. Picard felt the weight of that purpose settling into the room. The Federation had encountered beings who played with reality and phenomena that mocked physics, but this felt different in texture, not playful, not accidental. The tier carried a gravity of its own, a quiet insistence that said a door had been cut because someone needed it open. The captain's gaze remained steady, and under his breath the thought formed without drama. First contact was no longer a possibility. It was approaching. The opening expanded another fraction, and the storm around it fell into a deeper silence, as if the universe were holding its breath. The bridge waited with it, a suspended moment passing softly into the next, where the doorway would finally deliver what it had been carved to deliver. The first thing to cross was not a ship, nor a beam of light, nor any probe of energy. It was a body tumbling end over end through the widening tier as if thrown from a storm. The figure emerged surrounded by fragments of metal that moved with eerie coherence, spinning in a tight orbit the way moons circled a planet. Even through the vacuum of space, the fragments didn't drift. They held formation around the falling man, adjusting constantly, shielding him from debris and the raw violence of the breach itself. On the Enterprise bridge, the suddenness of it cut through every calculation. Sensors pinged, then screamed, then steadied into a reading that made no sense. A single life sign, human, alive in conditions where life should be impossible. No suit, no propulsion system, no visible technology. Yet the body slowed as it neared the Enterprise, deceleration smooth and controlled, like an invisible hand had caught the fall and chosen to release it gently into normal space. The view screen magnified. The man's cape was torn, dark crimson twisting with a life of its own in microgravity. Armor plates clung to his body, scarred by battle that looked as though it had taken place inside a furnace of collapsing worlds. Beneath the cape, the silhouette carried a kind of brutal elegance, not the posture of a drifting corpse, but the composure of someone still fighting even while falling. And the metal around him obeyed in silence, circling like loyal sentries. At that distance, no one on the bridge could hear breath or heartbeat, could not know the color of eyes or the shape of memory behind them. Yet something about the figure felt charged with will. The fragments orbiting him were not random wreckage. They were weapons. They were armor. They were proof that some force was guiding every atom of metal in that moving constellation. Picard's voice came steady and low across the bridge, less a command than a decision shaped by duty. Transporter Room 3, emergency beam out. Lock onto the individual only, full pattern buffers, maximum precision. The captain did not know who the visitor was, but knew one thing clearly: a living being did not belong in open space without a reason. First contact under impossible conditions demanded the Federation's best instincts, curiosity framed by caution. The breach reacted as if it sensed the rescue. Its edges flickered brighter, and the storm shifted, growing unstable. A final pulse surged, and then the tier began to close. Reality tugged itself inward, knitting along invisible seams. The colors thinned, the geometric wrongness folding away into absence. The door that had opened deliberately now shut with visible reluctance, leaving only a scar of rippling space that weakened by the second. The transporter effect reached out like a net. Blue-white light wrapped the tumbling figure, catching metal fragments in its boundary. For a heartbeat, the orbiting pieces resisted, then aligned, allowing transport as if their obedience extended to the man's survival above all else. The body vanished from the void, leaving normal space behind, and the storm's rings faded as though robbed of purpose. On the bridge, silence landed. The view screen now showed only stars, stable and ordinary, while the crew processed what had just happened. A man had fallen through an impossible wound in space and survived the vacuum without technology. Metal had moved around him like thought given shape. An anomaly had opened for him, then sealed behind him with the finality of a door closing after a guest enters. Picard didn't move back to the chair. A quiet awareness passed through the captain that this event was not ending with transport. It was beginning. The Enterprise had not simply rescued a stranger from death. It had received a visitor from a reality shaped by laws no databank could name, a man whose arrival carried the weight of storms still unseen. The bridge held that realization gently, letting it pass forward into the next breath of the story. Transporter Room 3 was already lit in alert red when the beam resolved. The pattern buffer stabilized, the air shimmered, and the stranger materialized in a kneeling posture, cape settling around him like a storm collapsing into fabric. The orbiting metal did not scatter on arrival. It snapped into formation instantly, rising into the air as if the room itself had become a magnetic field. Worf's security team tensed, weapons half-raised, yet trained discipline held them from firing. The steel fragments hovered in a protective perimeter around their owner, neither attacking nor retreating, simply waiting. The containment field flared on Picard's order. Cylinders of force shimmered into existence, layering between the stranger and the room like transparent armor. The field was calibrated for hostile biological and energy phenomena, but no one on the technical crew could be sure it would matter. The surreal calm of the visitor and the organized obedience of the metal suggested that control, not chaos, defined whatever power had brought him here. In sickbay, Crusher prepared the isolation bay, triorder already spiking in response to energy signatures bleeding through the ship's internal sensors. The readings were not radiation, not subspace leakage, not anything the medical database could tag. They were electromagnetic gradients that rose and fell with the rhythm of a heartbeat. Every metal instrument in the bay trembled faintly in place, responding to a proximity it could not contextualize. Picard arrived moments later with Data and Troy, leaving Riker to command the bridge. The captain's stride was calm, but the mind behind it moved quickly. First contact protocol demanded respect. Security protocol demanded containment. In rare cases, the two could be the same act. Picard wasn't interested in dominance, only in keeping his crew safe while granting an unknown visitor a fair chance to explain why the universe had delivered him through a wound in space. The isolation bay doors opened. The visitor lay on the biobed, unconscious but breathing, chest rising steadily under battle-worn armor. The cape draped across the bed's edge like spilled wine. Metallic fragments that had hovered in transporter space now lined the air around him, suspended without visible support. Some were shards, others recognizable as parts of machinery from a world not yet identified. They remained still in quiet vigilance, a silent reminder that even asleep, their master was not defenseless. Troy's empathic sense brushed the edge of the containment field and met a mind that felt like iron tempered in fire. There was rage held in discipline, grief compressed into sharp edges, and underneath it, a core of stubborn survival. No deception, no immediate hostility, only the deep tension of someone who had lived too long in war to trust peace quickly. She let that understanding settle into her posture, keeping her presence soft and non-threatening. Data stepped closer, golden eyes tracking every fluctuation. The android registered micro-variations in the field around the stranger, magnetic not subspace, controlled not random. The effect wasn't technological in form. No implant, no emitter, no known device. Yet the control was absolute, the kind that came from mastery rather than machinery. Data stored the observation quietly, not for judgment but for eventual understanding. Crusher began the scan with careful distance. Vital signs normal for a human male under extreme stress. Oxygenation stable. Cellular regeneration elevated, likely due to adrenaline and recovery response. Then the tricorder's electromagnetic sensor went wild, forcing her to recalibrate. The field surrounding the body was so strong it threatened to scramble the instrument's finer readings. She found the nerve to call that out without panic, grounding the moment in professionalism. The visitor was alive, stable, and radiating a power that made sickbay feel less like a hospital and more like a storm shelter. Picard watched the man's face, calm in sleep yet carved with the kind of history that left lines deeper than age. Whoever this was, he had not drifted into the Enterprise by mistake. His arrival had been escorted by a door cut through reality itself. The captain felt the quiet gravity of that fact settle into his chest, and without raising his voice, let the next instruction fall into place. Maintain the containment field for now. Let him wake in safety. When consciousness returns, we speak first as beings, not as threats. Sickbay held that decision gently. The containment field hummed. The metal fragments remained suspended like a crown around their sleeping king. And the Enterprise, having retrieved a stranger from impossible space, waited for the stranger to return from impossible sleep, handing the narration forward into the moment of awakening. Consciousness returned like a blade sliding from its sheath, not a slow rise, not a fog lifting, but an instant clarity born from years of waking to danger. The stranger's eyes opened and found the ceiling without confusion. Sterile white panels, soft medical light, a hum of advanced machinery that felt alien, yet disciplined. The mind behind those eyes did not drift, it catalogued. Air was breathable, gravity stable. The faint vibration of a starship engine pulsed through the deck. A containment field shimmered around the bed, a translucent barrier that carried the smell of caution. Beyond it stood uniformed figures moving with deliberate calm. Starfleet, the insignia suggested, but not the Starfleet of any world he had known. The cut of the uniforms, the technology, the subtle hum of a ship that had crossed centuries. This was not simply another country or another planet. This was another age. The man's awareness reached outward and felt metal everywhere, not by sight but by sense, as naturally as hearing. The bed frame, the hinge in the door, the microfilaments in the tricorder, the bulkheads behind the walls, the hidden spine of the ship itself. Every atom containing iron or alloy answered like a choir waiting for a conductor. That sense was steady, present, and intact. A hard relief settled in his chest. Whatever had torn him through realities, it had not severed what he was. A slow breath followed, controlled. The body lay still, but the air around it changed. Surgical tools on nearby trays quivered. A hypospray rolled half a centimeter, then stopped, caught in an invisible grip. Metal fragments that had hovered before slowly reoriented, forming a quiet defensive curve above the biobed. Not an attack, only a protective reflex. Power driven by habit rather than anger. Crusher's voice reached him in a tone shaped for crisis without provoking it. She identified herself, asked if language was understood, confirmed safety aboard the Enterprise. The words were calm and professional, yet his mind tightened around one detail. Enterprise, a name worn by many ships in many worlds, yet this one sounded heavier, older, as if history here had chosen it differently. The man sat up slowly, not to appear weak, not to appear threatening, but to be ready. Battle had taught him the importance of posture. The containment field shimmered at the edge of his movement, a polite cage. He studied its frequency without touching it, already feeling how magnetism might resonate through the force boundary. Even a prison had to be measured before it could be respected or broken. Speech came steady and low, the language smooth in his mouth, though the voice carried a rasp of exhaustion beneath iron discipline. Understanding was clear. The translator in the room was elegant. Whoever built this ship had learned to bridge species, and that meant the society behind it might have learned to bridge conflicts too. Yet clarity did not bring trust. Trust required history, and history had rarely favored people like him. He named himself before they needed to ask. Erik Lehnsherr, known to many as Magneto. The name tasted like old wars: mutant, survivor, defender. Each title carried a weight that did not need explanation to be felt. His eyes swept the room again, pausing on the android with golden eyes, on the woman whose presence pressed gently into his emotional perimeter, on the doctor whose hands were careful not to shake. None of them carried the scent of cruelty. Still, cruelty often wore calm faces at first. A memory flickered, the rift, the tearing pressure, the moment the sky became wrong, the force that had seized him without consent. He had been fighting when the universe cut a door under his feet, and now found himself in a place that was not his battlefield. The question was not only where he was, but why he had been placed here, and whether the force behind it still hunted him. His attention returned to the containment field, then drifted beyond to the ship's unseen corridors. A starship, a future, a civilization whose metal bones he could feel as easily as pulse. That sense was both comfort and warning. In a world made of steel, a man who ruled magnetism was never helpless, but helplessness was not the greatest danger. The greatest danger was a universe that might demand he become something worse to survive. The cloak across his shoulders settled as he breathed again. The room remained poised in calm tension, and the air between visitor and crew thickened with impending meaning. Awakening had finished. Contact was about to begin, passing softly into the first true meeting. Picard entered sickbay with the quiet gravity of someone who had met the unknown many times and never treated it casually. The corridor doors parted, and the captain moved through them with Data and Troy at his flank. Crusher remained near the biobed, holding her triorder low, letting presence speak before instruments did. Security stood at distance, phasers ready but not raised. The room was arranged like a negotiation without a table yet present. Magneto watched their approach in stillness. The man in command carried himself not with dominance but with containment of force, a kind of authority that did not need volume. That registered immediately, and it unsettled something deep. Power that chooses restraint, power that wears diplomacy as armor. It was rare in any century, rare enough to be suspect, rare enough to be worth hearing. Picard gave his name, his rank, his purpose. The Federation, the Enterprise, the need to understand the circumstances of arrival. No threat embedded in the words, only careful clarity. Magneto listened without interrupting, letting tone and posture land as fully as the facts. With calm certainty, the captain asked the question that mattered most: origin, identity, intent. The answer came without hesitation and without performance. Erik Lehnsherr spoke of Earth, but not their Earth. A world familiar by name yet scarred by different histories. A world where mutants existed, where fear of difference had become policy, where survival had required steel and fire. His voice was controlled, yet a furnace lived under it. The title Magneto followed not as boast, but as reality, a name given by battles others started. Data's gaze sharpened at the mention of magnetism. The android's curiosity did not feel like suspicion. It felt like hunger for knowledge. He asked about the mechanism, about how control operated without technology, about the range and structure of the electromagnetic field that surrounded him. Magneto felt the sincerity there, and for a heartbeat allowed himself a small shift in tension. This one wanted to understand, not exploit. Understanding was a language he respected, even when he did not share the worldview behind it. He demonstrated lightly. A metal tray rose from a counter, rotated, and folded into a thin ribbon that hovered in air like a suspended thought. Nothing excessive, nothing violent. A reminder rather than a threat. The containment field shimmered, and the metal fragments around him subtly aligned, responding to the movement with quiet discipline. Magneto let the tray settle back into place. The act answered questions without inviting fear. Troy spoke softly, her words gentle but precise. She offered a sense that his concern for safety was real, that anger lived in him but was not pointed at them in this moment. The empathic reading was accurate, and Magneto noted it with a quiet edge of caution. Minds that could read emotion were dangerous in different ways, yet her presence did not feel invasive. It felt respectful, like a hand placed near a wound without pressing. Picard remained steady through all of it, neither flinching nor romanticizing what he saw. He acknowledged the impossibility of a human surviving vacuum, the energies detected around the breach, the metal that moved around his guest. He did not call it magic. He did not call it witchcraft. He called it an extraordinary phenomenon deserving careful study and cooperative understanding. The language was clinical, but the intention underneath was humane. That distinction mattered. Magneto's mind ran parallel to the conversation. A Federation starship built on cooperation, an android seeking truth, an empath who could sense grief, a captain who spoke of welcome without surrendering caution. It was a strange arrangement, almost ideal. Yet idealism had also been the mask worn by hypocrites back home. The question was whether this future had truly outgrown the fear of difference, or whether it had only refined its vocabulary for it. He asked for time, for clarity, for access to understand what had brought him here, and whether the force behind the rift still threatened his people. The words came steady and low, framed as a shared problem rather than a demand. He had learned long ago that alliances formed fastest when both sides felt survival at stake. Picard nodded and with a calm hand gesture ordered the containment field lowered. The shield shimmered out, leaving air between them unbroken, a risk taken deliberately to build trust where none yet existed. Magneto felt the shift immediately, not as a loss of safety, but as a statement. This captain was willing to meet power without cages, provided power returned the respect. The first contact did not end in warmth or certainty, but it ended in a shared space where conversation could continue. Sickbay's air softened slightly, handing the story onward into the next movement, where understanding would be tested by the universe's next demand. The name settled into sickbay like a stone placed on a table, heavy with history even in a room that had never heard it before. Magneto's posture remained upright, shoulders squared not in defiance but in habit, the kind built from decades of standing before crowds who either worshipped or feared what they did not understand. Erik Lehnsherr was not a man who arrived gently in any world, and yet here the voice had come steady and low, offered without demand. A name first, then the truth behind it. The captain's calm welcome had lowered the containment field, and that change in atmosphere mattered. It was a choice made through trust, and Magneto did not dismiss choices like that. Such gestures were rare where he came from. Their cages were built early, questions asked later. Here the cage had been removed before certainty existed. The future, at least in this corner of it, carried different instincts. That difference pressed against old scars, stirring a cautious curiosity beneath the iron discipline. Magneto let his gaze move across the faces in front of him, reading without rushing to judgment. Picard carried command the way a lighthouse holds light, not as a weapon, but as a guide through dangerous water. Data stood as an impossibility shaped into patience, eyes bright with the kind of wonder that made no room for insult. Troy watched from the edge, presence soft, attention precise, like a quiet mirror reflecting emotional truth, whether one wished to see it or not. Crusher held professionalism close, her hands careful not to tremble, the triorder's fluctuations not enough to shake her steadiness. This was a team that knew how to stand before the unknown without becoming small. A new universe demanded new alignment. Magneto did not pretend otherwise. Still, survival had taught that every world repeated its cruelty in different costumes. The Federation spoke of unity, but unity depended on who held power and who was allowed to be different without punishment. The question behind the question rose in him with calm certainty. Would they treat a mutant as a guest or as a problem to be solved? He made the truth plain because half-truths invited control. Mutants were a branch of human evolution, born with abilities tied to biology rather than technology. His ability was not a trick, not a tool someone had installed, but a force that lived in the same marrow as memory. Magnetism, electromagnetism, the full spectrum of fields that threaded matter together. Control over metal, over waves, over the iron within blood itself when driven to desperate extremes. The power to shape force fields, ride magnetic currents through air, silence machines with electromagnetic pulses. Not a boast, only an accounting. In his world, denying power had cost lives. The words carried an undercurrent the room could feel even if they could not name it. This power had not been used for sport. It had been used for survival in a world that hunted those who carried difference in their DNA. Magneto did not say victim, did not say hero. He said defender, and that title held both tenderness and ruthlessness, two sides of the same coin minted in war. Picard listened without visible reaction, yet something in the captain's eyes acknowledged the weight of the biography beneath the surface. A leader who had carried moral burdens recognized another who had carried them by necessity. That recognition did not erase distrust, but it laid a bridge where conversation could continue. Magneto's mind returned to the breach that had pulled him here. The pull had not felt random. It had felt aimed, like a hook cast through reality to retrieve something. If the force behind it still moved, it might be searching for him now, or searching through him for this universe's weaknesses. The thought came as a quiet warning rather than panic, and he brought it forward softly. Whoever opened that door might return, and if they did, both ship and crew would need to be prepared for the kind of enemy that used realities as corridors. The air in sickbay held in solemn stillness, the name Magneto now fully anchored in their century, while outside, the stars continued their indifferent drift. The introduction had ended, but the meaning of it had only begun, handing the story forward into the crew's attempt to explain the world that had received him. Picard did not rush to fill the silence. The captain understood that first contact lived in the space between words as much as in speech itself. A displaced visitor carried shock even when discipline hid it, and the Federation had long learned that clarity given gently could prevent fear from taking root. His posture remained calm, voice low, and the explanation began as a bridge laid plank by plank across centuries. This ship was the Enterprise, flagship of the United Federation of Planets. Not a military vessel in the crude sense, though weapons existed for defense. It was an instrument of exploration, diplomacy, and scientific discovery. The Federation was not one species ruling another, but a union of many cultures choosing cooperation over conquest. Humans, Vulcans, Andorians, Tellarites, and worlds beyond count had built this civilization by refusing the old laws of isolation. The words came with calm certainty, not as propaganda, but as a matter of lived structure in the captain's world. Time then had to be named. Stardate 47,634.4, Earth year 2370. Nearly 4 centuries beyond Magneto's origin point by the ship's reckoning. His arrival had not only crossed universes, it had crossed eras. Picard's tone remained gentle while stating it, as though offering a hand to a man who had just been set down in a future that might feel like an alien ocean. Magneto held the information without outward flinch. The mind behind his eyes moved quickly, weighing what centuries might have done to human nature. The Federation spoke of unity among species, and the ship itself embodied it. Yet history had taught him that utopias could still hide their knives in soft cloth. Picard recognized the unspoken skepticism and addressed it without accusation. The Federation's rules existed because earlier humanity had failed. Centuries of mistakes, wars, and well-intended tyranny had shaped their ethics. The Prime Directive was one such rule, forbidding interference with developing civilizations, not because Starfleet lacked the power to change worlds, but because power imposed from above often poisoned the very future it meant to protect. The captain's voice carried the weight of someone who had followed that law at personal cost, a line drawn in the name of autonomy, even when the line cut through compassion. There was no demand that Magneto agree, only a request that he understand. Picard's world believed that sentient beings must be allowed to face their own destiny without becoming dependent on saviors. The Federation's strength was not that it could impose solutions, but that it could help equals help one another through shared consent. Data offered additional context softly, detailing starship technology with the quiet pride of a being who loved truth. Warp drive bent spacetime to cross stars faster than light. Transporters converted matter to energy and back, though their deeper mechanisms still carried mysteries even in this century. Replicators rearranged raw matter into food, tools, clothing, almost any non-living object with precise molecular control. The galaxy was vast, dangerous, and filled with anomalies that continued to challenge even Federation science. The Enterprise existed to meet those challenges. Magneto listened, senses searching for deception in tone rather than words. The calm sincerity was real. These people believed what they said. That did not make it safe, but it made it honorable. An honorable future was something he had spent a lifetime doubting could exist. The explanation ended with Picard's quiet invitation. As long as Magneto remained aboard, he would be treated as a guest under Federation protection, free to speak, to observe, to request help in understanding his displacement. Safety would be granted, but so would accountability. Power aboard this ship was not absolute, not even for the captain. It was shared through structure and trust. The room held the moment gently. Magneto's world had been shaped by oppression and survival. Picard's world had been shaped by cooperation and restraint. Two realities now faced each other across a sickbay floor, and the light between them felt like the first fragile thread of a larger weaving. The narration moved onward softly toward the next point where curiosity would press against power, and understanding would be tested in practice. Data stepped forward with the careful neutrality of someone who wished to learn without provoking. There was no fear in the android's face, only that focused brightness that came whenever an unsolved equation entered his awareness. Magneto noted the absence immediately. Fear in humans often came before words, shaping every question into a trap. Data's questions carried no trap, only sincere analysis. The android began with what he had already observed. During transport and awakening, metallic objects had responded to Magneto's unconscious state. The field behavior suggested constant, precise control, with fluctuations synchronized to neural patterns rather than external emitters. Data's voice remained even, as if steady tone could help translate the impossible into shared language. He asked how such control was achieved, and whether it required physical contact, line of sight, or proximity. The inquiry was respectful, yet its depth revealed the larger intent. He was trying to understand a phenomenon large enough to rewrite Federation physics. Magneto felt the ship's metal around him, listening like a tide. In another universe, such probing might have triggered instinctive defense. Here, the question came not from hunger for domination, but from hunger for truth. That distinction mattered. Precision was a language Magneto respected. It was also the language of survival. He answered plainly. Magnetism was not a tool, it was a field threaded through matter. Every atom with charge responded to it, every alloy carried the echo of it. His body, his mind, could sense those threads and pull them the way others pulled muscle. That awareness never turned fully off. It was a constant map of structure. Control required focus, but the field was always there, waiting. To illustrate without threatening, Magneto let a nearby medical instrument rise from its tray. The motion was smooth, almost graceful, like a leaf lifted by wind. He rotated it in air, then reshaped it, flattening one side, sharpening another, making the metal flow without heat. Data watched the transformation in silent astonishment, tracking micro-variations in field geometry in real time. The nurse beside Crusher inhaled sharply, then steadied. No one moved to draw a weapon. The room remained at a respectful distance, letting power speak while trust held. Magneto released the instrument. It settled back into place without impact, as though obeying gravity only after obedience to him had been satisfied. The hovering fragments around him adjusted subtly, still not aggressive, only aligned as guardians. Data's mind raced quietly, not with panic but with unfamiliar excitement. Federation science had encountered telekinesis, energy beings, and anomalies that bent reality. Still, this was something else. The field was measurable, yet its control was so precise it rivaled the ship's finest machinery. The mechanism was biological rather than technological, and that were the key difference. A living being acting as a conscious electromagnetic singularity. The android asked about limits, range, capacity, whether the field could interfere with subspace or warp systems. Magneto did not exaggerate. His power extended as far as the electromagnetic spectrum threaded the environment. Metal could be moved at great distance, waves bent, machines silenced. Electromagnetic pulses could collapse systems. Force fields shaped from magnetic pressure could withstand immense kinetic force. Even iron within blood could be influenced when necessary, though that act carried moral weight and was not done lightly. The truth was enough. He did not need to decorate it. Data absorbed every word like a star absorbing light, yet beyond the facts there was another recognition. This power was not inherently hostile. It was a tool of choice. Whether it became salvation or tyranny depended on the one who wielded it. Magneto saw that in Data's gaze and felt something rare settle in his chest, not trust yet, but the possibility of trust. A being who sought understanding rather than control could become ally rather than watcher. That possibility did not erase old suspicions, but it softened their edges. The exchange ended with Data stepping back, eyes still bright, voice steady with gratitude. The air of sickbay carried the hush of shared discovery, and Magneto felt the ship around him with new texture. This world wanted to understand him, not cage him. But understanding could lead to fear once knowledge spread. The thought lingered softly, handing the narration onward into the deeper collision of worldviews that was already forming beneath the calm surface. Peace between strangers often lasts only until principles touch. The conversation in sickbay had been careful, respectful, almost gentle, yet beneath it two histories pressed against one another like tectonic plates. Magneto carried a world where survival demanded force, where rights were not given but taken, where coexistence had been offered and betrayed so many times that betrayal became expectation. Picard carried a world where force was the last tool, where cooperation had become law, where the lesson of past cruelty was restraint shaped into civilization. Both men had seen too much to be naive. That was what made their differences dangerous. Picard spoke with calm certainty about Starfleet's mission: exploration without conquest, diplomacy before violence, ethical lines even when power made crossing them easy. In his universe, moral restraint was not weakness but the foundation of a society that had survived itself. The captain's voice was measured, but Magneto heard the steel beneath it. These were not casual ideals. They were vows the Federation had carved into its bones. Magneto let the explanation land, then answered from his own gravity. Ideals were precious, but ideals without teeth were graves waiting to be filled. In his timeline, humanity had promised tolerance while sharpening knives in secret. Governments had spoken of equality while building camps. He had watched history repeat itself through different flags. A civilization that believed it had transcended fear ran the risk of forgetting how quickly fear returns. The words came steady and low, not to provoke, but to warn. Troy sensed the pressure rising and placed a gentle frame around it. Both perspectives were born from trauma and responsibility. Neither sought cruelty. Each sought preservation, but by different routes. Her presence softened the sharpness without dulling the truth. Picard accepted that framing with quiet respect, then returned to the core. Power must not become unilateral law. The Federation had learned that even benevolent saviors can become tyrants the moment they decide other people's destinies for them. Cooperation was not just strategy, it was morality. A civilization deserved the right to struggle toward its future without outside hands rewriting its path. Magneto heard the argument clearly, and something in him tightened. In another age, those words might have been spoken by leaders who watched his people suffer and called their inaction principle. Autonomy mattered, yes, but what of autonomy when a group is hunted, powerless against extinction? When evil does not wait for committees? In his world, refusing to act had been the luxury of those not targeted. The moral cost of restraint fell hardest on the vulnerable. Picard did not flinch from the critique. He acknowledged that restraint carried burden. That command meant living with tragedies that could have been prevented by force and carrying those faces forever. But he held to a deeper belief. Without ethical lines, power corrodes even its owner. A future built on saving lives at any cost eventually loses the meaning of the lives it saves. Magneto did not reject the Federation outright. There was nobility in the philosophy, and he could feel it in the ship's very structure. This was a civilization where an android served as officer, where an empath was trusted, where species once at war now shared one bridge. That reality struck him with a quiet wonder he refused to show too easily. Yet wonder could not erase caution. A system as idealistic as this might crumble the moment it met an enemy that did not care about ideals. The clash did not erupt into hostility. It settled into a tense respect, like two swords crossed but not yet swung. Each man recognized the other's burden. Each doubted the other's method. And somewhere between doubt and respect lived the seed of a partnership that only crisis could force into bloom. Sickbay felt smaller as the universe outside grew larger. The bridge of ideals had been tested and still held, yet the tremor lines beneath it remained. The story handed forward softly, because even as they debated ethics, the tear in space was not finished with them, and the next demand of reality was already stirring. The shift came first as a whisper in the ship's sensors, subtle enough that only Data's constant diagnostic routines caught it. A faint rise in electromagnetic noise at the coordinates where the breach had sealed. A harmonic echo that should have dissipated into normal subspace residue, yet instead gathered itself into coherence. On the bridge, consoles flickered with new data, and the calm after the anomaly began to thin like mist before dawn. Riker stood at command, posture composed, but eyes narrowing as the readings climbed. The Enterprise drifted in apparently ordinary space, stars stable, no visible wound on the main screen. Still, the numbers did not lie. Something was returning to that point, not randomly, but with a rhythm that suggested intent. Elections of energy along the electromagnetic spectrum were rising in stair-step bursts, each higher than the last, the kind of periodicity that did not occur in natural storms. In sickbay, the ship's red alert had faded, but the atmosphere remained tuned to caution. Crusher watched Magneto's vitals stabilize, Troy's sense lingering beside the biobed, while Picard and Data prepared to return to the bridge. Magneto felt the change before anyone spoke. The ship's magnetic field shifted in a way that did not belong to internal systems, like a distant thunder rolling through metal bones, a pressure at the edge of perception, the same wrongness that had preceded the rift's first opening. He rose from the biobed without asking permission, movements slow and controlled so as not to trigger security reflexes. Metal fragments around him lifted slightly, answering the shift as if they recognized a predator stirring in the dark. The air in sickbay cooled as the containment field's hum returned to readiness, even though no new order had yet been given. Picard felt the movement and did not stop it. A guest could stand. A defender could prepare. He glanced toward Data, who had already received the bridge update. The android's eyes carried a sharpness that signaled urgency without panic. The breach point is exhibiting renewed activity. The words came calm and fast, energy levels increasing exponentially, consistent with the harmonic signature of the original fracture. Magneto's jaw tightened in recognition not of the signature, but of the pattern. Doors that open deliberately tend to open again. Wars seldom end with one strike. Whoever had cut through realities to bring him here had either followed or had left the door as a corridor for something else. The thought settled into him with calm certainty, and his gaze lifted toward the medical bay's ceiling as though he could see through decks into the stars. Picard moved toward the sickbay exit with measured speed. The quiet tone of command returned to his voice, soft but absolute. Bridge, return to red alert. Raise shields. Route auxiliary power to structural integrity. Mr. Worf, be ready to fire only on my order. The captain did not yet know what was coming, but he knew that the next moment would not allow hesitation. Magneto stepped beside Picard, not behind. The decision was not spoken as a request. It was spoken in proximity and posture. If the rift returned, it was tied to him, and that made it his responsibility too. Picard did not challenge the implication. Federation command was built on cooperation, even with the unknown. The turbo lift doors parted, and the ship carried them upward into the red-lit tension of the bridge. Outside, in the cold of space, the coordinates shimmered again. Reality began to tremble at its seam, not yet splitting, but preparing to split. The storm that had faded was gathering a new breath. Magneto felt the metal around him listen. Picard felt the weight of first contact, returning with sharper edges. The Enterprise turned its attention back toward the point where the universe had already broken once, and the narration passed softly forward into the moment where the tier would open again, and whatever was on the other side would finally show its hand. The breach reopened without spectacle, and that restraint made it worse. No explosion, no roar, only a smooth undoing of space as the seam returned to the same jagged geometry, as if reality remembered the cut and surrendered to it again. The electromagnetic storm thickened in layered rings around the opening, brighter now, more disciplined, shaped like a field under command. The Enterprise's shields flared in response, catching the first wave of pressure like a held breath. From the center of the tier, something moved. Not a ship, not a being of flesh, not even a shadow in the usual sense. It arrived as a density of metal and energy fused together, a shape assembling itself mid-transition. At first there were only fragments, dark plates and skeletal struts tumbling outward. Then the fragments aligned. They snapped into a structure that looked like a creature built from wreckage and intention. Long limbs hinged at impossible angles, a core that pulsed with cold light. Strands of magnetized debris spiraling around it like tendons. Federation sensors struggled to label it because it didn't fit any taxonomy of life. It was not alive by biological standards, but it was not inert either. It carried purpose the way a predator carries hunger. Its body was a hybrid of alloy and electromagnetism, a machine that had learned to move like an animal. As it crossed into normal space, the storm around it followed, feeding it a shield of distorted magnetic force. The creature did not drift. It oriented directly toward the Enterprise the way a compass points north, as though the ship's warp core were a beacon it had been born to hunt. Magneto felt the thing before the bridge finished naming it. The ship's metal bones shivered at its proximity, and the electromagnetic spectrum around the breach bent toward the predator like a river toward a sinkhole. His senses caught the quiet signature of artificial design, not Federation, not Romulan, not anything he recognized from his own universe. Yet the logic was clear. It was built to eat power, built to seek dense technology, built to treat starships as nourishment. On the bridge, Data's voice came layered with urgency. The object is generating a localized magnetic inversion field. It is siphoning energy directly through our shield harmonics. Power loss across primary systems is accelerating. Geordi's hands moved fast across the engineering interface. The drain wasn't ripping through circuits like a weapon. It was drinking through them like thirst. Warp efficiency dipped. Life support fluctuations appeared in secondary grids, and the structural integrity field began to thin under electromagnetic stress. The predator drifted closer, and its core brightened with each pull. As it fed, plating across its limbs rearranged, adapting in real time. It had the instinct of a living thing and the flexibility of advanced technology. It was a predator shaped by physics not as prey but as pathway. Picard held his posture steady, gaze fixed forward. In his career, the unknown had often arrived as intelligence to negotiate with or force to endure. This arrived as hunger made machine, and hunger did not negotiate. The captain's mind moved through options with calm certainty, already feeling the edge of a decision that might demand both diplomacy and force, yet knowing neither would matter if the ship lost power first. Magneto stepped forward slightly, not dramatic, only inevitable. The thing belonged to his domain in a way phasers did not because it was metal alone, but because it was magnetism turned predatory. He felt its field scrape against the Enterprise and understood the danger with an old, cold clarity. If it latched fully, it would hollow the ship from the inside, not out of malice, but out of instinct. The Predator's shadow moved over the view screen as it closed distance. The bridge lights dimmed another notch under the drain. The Enterprise's crew held their stations, poised between failure and response, while the moment passed softly forward into the first test of whether Starfleet weapons could touch what had come through the tier. Worf's tactical display tracked the Predator's approach in clean Klingon geometry, and yet the numbers beneath the lines carried a quiet disbelief. Shields continued to flare, but their harmonic frequency buckled each time the creature pulled. The drain was not blunt, not accidental. It was precise, almost surgical, targeting the ship's electromagnetic pathways the way a predator targets the throat. Picard gave the order with calm certainty, not because he believed in the weapon, but because a captain must learn the nature of a threat before conceding to it. Fire phasers, minimum spread, targeted at the core. Worf's hands moved. Beams lanced outward, a clean line of Federation light cutting through the dark and striking the creature's center mass. The result was silence. The beams flared against the Predator and passed as if through mist. Sensors registered contact and non-contact simultaneously. A flicker of distortion rippled across its plating, then vanished. The creature did not recoil. It did not even slow. The phaser energy seemed to slide into its field and dissolve into the storm feeding it. The drain increased, almost as if the attack had become an additional meal. Quantum torpedoes followed in controlled sequence, detonations blooming in pale fire against the void. For one suspended heartbeat, the creature's outline fractured into segmented afterimages, then reassembled without injury. The torpedo's force did not find purchase in a body that existed half a step sideways from normal spacetime. Data's voice came steady but sharpened by urgency. The entity is phase-shifted within a layered magnetic field. Our weapons operate in four-dimensional space. Its structural coherence is distributed across electromagnetic planes perpendicular to our frame. The energy we deliver is being absorbed or redirected through those planes. Geordi's analysis supported it. The creature wasn't armored against firepower. It was aligned around it. Every beam and blast became another current in the storm it rode, a reinforcement rather than a wound. Classic defense was meaningless here, because the threat was not an enemy who feared damage. It was a system that fed on attempts to stop it. On the bridge, the red alert lighting grew deeper as systems dipped further. Life support stabilized, but auxiliary power reserves began to thin. The warp core held, yet just barely, carried by redundant circuits that weren't designed to bear the full load of a hungry electromagnetic void. The Enterprise was not losing a battle of violence. It was losing a battle of endurance, time draining out of the ship like blood from a cut that no bandage could close. Magneto felt the failure of Starfleet weapons as an echo in his own domain. The Predator's field was unfamiliar, but its nature was clear. It treated conventional force like wind against a mountain. The only thing that could touch it was a force speaking its own language, magnetism, electromagnetism, the subtle laws that shaped its existence. Picard turned his head slightly toward Magneto, not as surrender, but as recognition. The Federation had built its strength on science and cooperation. This moment demanded both in a new form. The captain's voice stayed level, yet carried a shift from command to alliance. "Dr. Lehnsherr, if you have a method to counter this, I want it now." Magneto did not answer with haste. His mind moved through the creature's field the way a surgeon's fingers move through tissue, careful not to cut what must be understood first. He felt the structure of its magnetic inversion, sensed the way it drank from the ship's harmonics, detected a core where metal and energy braided into a single hunger. The decision formed without drama. He would not allow this ship to die in front of him while he stood idle with the one power that could stop it. Yet stopping it would require more than raw force. It would require precision, and perhaps the Enterprise itself lending strength. The Predator moved closer, and the bridge lights dimmed again. Starfleet firepower had failed, and the space between failure and salvation narrowed to the rhythm of a draining warp core. The narration passed softly forward into the moment when Magneto would step into the fight, and the bridge would learn what magnetism looks like when it meets a creature made of hunger. Magneto moved without ceremony, the way a storm front shifts across a sky. The bridge was not his battlefield, yet the threat outside had already made it one. The Predator's magnetic field pressed against the Enterprise like teeth against bone, and the ship's metal skeleton answered in trembling sympathy. He felt it all, each bolt and bulkhead vibrating under the strain, each electromagnetic pathway bending toward the drain. The Enterprise was being pulled apart by a language of force he understood better than any weapon on the bridge. He stepped to the command platform's edge, not to challenge Picard, but to stand where his will could reach through the view screen and into the storm. The cape settled behind him, heavy with silence rather than drama, his eyes fixed on the Predator and the field around it, reading the geometry in layers invisible to the rest of the crew. With calm certainty, he extended his awareness outward. The metal fragments that had followed him through realities lifted from their resting positions, rising into a slow orbit around him. They did not whirl wildly. They held formation, ready, disciplined, like soldiers awaiting a signal. The air along the bridge seemed to sharpen as the ship's magnetic environment shifted under his presence. He did not speak loudly. The words came steady and low, intended for Picard alone, yet heard by all. Your weapons cannot touch it. It lives within a magnetic phase state. If we do nothing, it will hollow your systems in minutes. I can restrain it, but not without support. The admission carried neither pride nor fear, only reality. A predator this size, tuned to feed on starships, could not be crushed by brute force alone. Its field had depth and complexity, and its storm was a reservoir it could drink from endlessly unless cut off at the source. Magneto raised his hand slightly, palm angling toward the view screen, fingers spreading as if feeling the air. Outside, the Predator's surrounding debris trembled and shifted. The storm's spirals wavered. The creature paused in its approach for the first time, sensing resistance in the only language that mattered to it. He wrapped his will around the metallic lattice within the Predator, not forcing it to tear immediately, but locking it into place. Plates that had been rearranging stopped mid-motion. Limbs that had been flexing across electromagnetic planes stiffened as though caught in invisible ice. The creature thrashed, not in pain, but in hunger frustrated. Its field surged outward in a pulse that rattled the Enterprise's shields. Magneto held firm. A force field formed around him on the bridge, subtle and unseen, a magnetic pressure barrier that anchored his body against the backlash. His mind remained calm, sharp as a blade, tracking the Predator's core as it struggled. The drain slowed, not stopped but reduced enough for the ship's systems to breathe. Data watched in silent intensity, sensors translating Magneto's invisible work into graphs of magnetic geometry and electromagnetic torsion. The patterns were coherent, stable, guided by conscious intention in ways no Federation subspace theory described. Geordi felt the difference in engineering, seeing warp efficiency stabilize slightly as the Predator's pull weakened. Yet the strain on Magneto grew. The creature's field was not a simple magnetosphere. It was layered, engineered for resistance, tuned to slip between normal magnetic laws. Holding it required constant precision, and precision required energy. He could feel his own neural focus tightening, the cost of sustaining Omega-level control against a hungry dimensional machine. Picard read the silent calculus unfolding. A man newly arrived in their universe was now serving as their shield, bearing strain that did not belong to him. The captain's voice remained calm, but the urgency beneath it was undeniable. "Mr. LaForge, Commander Data, find a way to support Dr. Lehnsherr. If technology can amplify his field the way we amplify shields, do it." Magneto did not glance back. His focus remained outward, binding the Predator in place while the Enterprise scrambled to become more than prey. He felt the ship's own electromagnetic lattice around him and understood something with quiet inevitability. This civilization had built itself on fields and currents it never realized could summon predators like this. Now those same fields might become the weapon that saved it. The creature held in magnetic restraint, its storm still raging but no longer advancing. The Enterprise's crew moved to meet Magneto halfway, and the moment passed softly forward into the next step, where Starfleet science would attempt something unprecedented, turning a starship into an amplifier for a mutant's will. The Predator fought silently against Magneto's restraint, and silence made the battle feel larger. There was no scream, no roar, only spikes in the electromagnetic storm and the subtle tremor of metal under immense stress. Its body twisted across planes that Starfleet sensors could only approximate. Each pulse it sent into the void was an attempt to slip sideways into a frequency Magneto could not hold. Yet each time it tried, his will followed, tightening like a net. He worked with precision rather than rage. Brute force would shatter metal and scatter energy into the storm, giving the Predator new paths to feed. Instead, Magneto sought the core geometry of its field. The creature was built around a magnetic inversion lattice, a heart of rotating currents that pulled energy from anything with charge. If that inversion could be neutralized, the Predator would starve, lose coherence, and collapse into inert matter. His mind slipped into the pattern like a lock picking its own door. He felt the storm's resonance, traced the current spirals, and began to reverse their polarity in localized pockets. The work was delicate, too aggressive, and the field would explode outward, ripping the ship's shields with it. Too gentle, and the Predator would adapt, reshaping its lattice into a new hunger. Every second demanded recalibration. On the bridge, Data translated what he could. Dr. Lehnsherr is generating counter-rotational magnetic nodes within the entity's field. If he maintains coherence, the inversion lattice may destabilize, but the energy requirement is accelerating beyond sustainable biological limits. Magneto heard that through the haze of focus and agreed silently. The cost was rising. Holding the Predator in place while rewriting its magnetic heart was like trying to disassemble a moving engine with bare hands. Even for him, the strain pressed into nerves, into breath, into the quiet spaces of the mind where fatigue accumulates before the body admits it. Picard felt the edge of a decision returning. The Enterprise could not remain passive. If magnetism was the only counter, then the ship must become part of that magnetism. The captain turned to Geordi and Data, voice steady. "Find a way to synchronize our deflector output with his field. We have done the reverse before in theory. Do it now." Geordi's visor lifted slightly as he stared down his console, seeing the ship's electromagnetic profile like a living map. The deflector dish could shape subspace fields, but its power output traveled through electromagnetic channels first. If those channels could be tuned to resonate with Magneto's frequency, it could become a reservoir for his work. Data processed at speeds beyond human nerve. He layered Magneto's field signature over the ship's deflector harmonics, searching for overlap. The patterns were not identical but compatible. A resonance frequency emerged, imperfect yet stable. It would not mimic Magneto's control, but it could amplify his reach the way a microphone amplifies a voice. They routed auxiliary power to the deflector, adjusted its output geometry, and with Picard's order engaged the modification. Outside, the dish glowed with building energy. Inside, Magneto felt it like a tide rising beneath his feet. Not magic, not mutant power, but a technological field tuned close enough to feed his own control. The surge steadied him. The net around the predator tightened. His counter-rotational nodes grew stronger, reversing polarity in larger segments. The creature convulsed, storm flaring in a desperate spike, and for a moment the Enterprise's shields groaned under the backlash. Yet the deflector held, shaping the resonance into a stable channel that poured strength into Magneto's work. He leaned into that strength without pride. This was not his victory alone. This was cooperation becoming survival in real time, a future built on fields and ethics now lending its machinery to a man born from a world of wars. The Predator's inversion lattice began to crack, not visibly to the eye, but in the subtle way its pull faltered, the way its storm sputtered as if starved of rhythm. Magneto felt the shift and pushed with calm certainty, reversing the last aligned currents toward collapse. The bridge watched the threat weaken under a counter only Magneto could shape, and a support only Starfleet could supply. The moment handed softly forward into the final strike, where science would join the mutants' restraint in one coordinated blow to end the Predator's hunger. With the deflector dish resonating in alignment, the Enterprise became more than a target. It became a participant. Power surged through the ship's electromagnetic lattice, no longer bleeding purely into shields, but flowing outward as a structured amplification of Magneto's field. The bridge felt it in the way systems stabilized, in the way the storm outside began to lose coherence. The Predator remained bound, but now it was bound not only by one man's will, but by a starship choosing to share that burden. Geordi watched the energy curves climb, fingers moving carefully. Too much raw power would scorch the resonance and snap the harmonic bridge between man and machine. Too little would feed the Predator's recovery. He adjusted output in fine increments, guided by Data's constant translation of Magneto's needs. Data stood almost still in the center of a storm of equations. He could not feel magnetism the way Magneto did, but he could model its behavior. He read the Predator's inversion lattice as a shifting mathematical object, mapping its collapse probability. It is reaching instability threshold, he reported, voice steady. If we deliver a synchronized electromagnetic pulse focused on the core, we may force total field inversion and structural failure. Picard absorbed it, gaze fixed forward. The plan carried risk. Their earlier phaser fire had fed the creature. Another pulse could do the same unless tuned precisely. Yet the ship had already crossed the line between observation and survival. Now it needed to trust the hybrid solution it had just built. The words came steady and low through the captain. Prepare an electromagnetic burst through the deflector at Data's frequency. Coordinate the timing with Dr. Lehnsherr's field. Worf, hold weapons. This will be our strike. Outside, the Predator thrashed harder as its storm lost rhythm. Its limbs jerked, trying to reassemble its magnetic heart, but Magneto's counternodes had already infected its lattice. Its hunger now fought itself. Each pull it attempted folded back into resistance, like teeth biting air. Magneto felt the moment approaching. The deflector's resonance held steady under him, giving his control a wider reach. He wrapped his awareness tighter around the core, preparing to reverse polarity on his mark. The strain was immense, but the support beneath it made the effort possible. He did not speak loudly, only let the thought pass outward, on my signal. Picard nodded once, even if Magneto could not see it. The Enterprise's systems aligned. Engineering routed energy into the deflector's capacitor banks. The dish brightened to a pale, controlled brilliance. Geordi held the output at the razor edge of stability. Data gave the final timing window. Magneto's hand tightened slightly, and with calm certainty the signal came. Now. The deflector released a pulse, not a wild emp, but a focused electromagnetic inversion wave tuned to the Predator's collapsing heart. The wave cut through the storm and struck the core exactly as Magneto reversed polarity from within. two forces speaking the same language from opposite sides of reality. For a heartbeat, the Predator's body froze. Its storm collapsed inward. Metal plating shuddered as its inversion lattice flipped against itself. The hunger that had pulled the Enterprise apart now turned inward, devouring its own coherence. Then the structure failed, not exploding outward, but imploding into a dense scatter of inert fragments that drifted harmlessly, stripped of field and purpose. The storm dissipated like smoke losing heat. The drain vanished from Enterprise systems in a sudden, clean silence. On the bridge, lights stabilized, systems returned to normal power flow, and the ship's shields lowered from strain to readiness. Magneto released his field slowly, letting the last metallic fragments settle. Breath returned in full measure, not triumph but relief. Picard exhaled softly, more in gratitude than victory. Science and magnetism had met, not in theory, but in necessity. A predator born from broken reality had been stopped by a fusion neither world could have achieved alone. The calm that followed was fragile and sacred, handing the narration forward into the aftermath, where questions would deepen, and the universe would reveal that this threat had not come alone. The bridge did not celebrate, it breathed. The Predator's collapse left behind a field of drifting scrap that looked almost peaceful against the stars, yet Magneto could still feel the ghost of its hunger in the fading electromagnetic residue. The Enterprise stabilized in a long, careful exhale. Consoles returned to their steady hum, shield harmonics smoothed into normal rhythm, and the red alert lighting softened as if the ship itself were lowering its shoulders after holding them too long under strain. Magneto stood near the command platform, cape still, hands relaxed at his sides. The deflector resonance that had amplified his control faded gradually, its withdrawal like a tide retreating from shore. With its retreat came the true weight of what had just happened. A future he did not belong to had nearly died before his eyes, and it had survived because two worldviews had been forced to cooperate at the edge of failure. That truth landed in him with a quiet heaviness, not pride, not joy, but the sober recognition of responsibility taking a new shape. Around him, Starfleet officers moved with disciplined calm, yet their attention occasionally returned to him in brief glances. Not fear now, not suspicion, something more complicated. Respect tethered to unease, gratitude braided with the uncertainty of what it meant to share a ship with a man who could bend a starship's skin as easily as wind bends grass. Magneto noticed without reacting. In his life, every room had eventually become that mixture of admiration and worry. It was the price of power in any civilization, no matter how enlightened it claimed to be. Picard remained at the center of that calm, posture steady, voice carrying no triumph. He thanked Magneto in the Federation way, acknowledging service without elevating it into worship. There was no talk of destiny, no insistence that Magneto was meant to be here, only the clean recognition that a sentient being had acted to save other sentient beings. The simplicity of that exchange cut deeper than ceremony. It reminded Magneto of something he had nearly forgotten in his own wars, that gratitude could exist without manipulation. Data approached with careful interest, already processing the residual field behavior. The android's curiosity had not diminished, but it had matured. There was awe now, not naive, but informed by survival. He spoke of the magnetic inversion lattice within the Predator, of how Magneto's counterrotational nodes had worked as if they were equations written into instinct. The way Data framed it carried a subtle gift. He was not reducing Magneto to a weapon. He was treating him as a knowledge system, a distinct kind of intelligence with its own laws. Magneto accepted that with a silence that was almost warmth. Geordi's voice came through the bridge network from engineering. Warp systems recovered, life support stable, no casualties. The ship had survived without losing a single crew member. Magneto let the number pass through him like a tide of relief he did not allow to show. Survival without sacrifice was rare enough to feel unreal. In his universe, victory always demanded blood. Here, for this moment, collaboration had offered a third path. Yet the calm was not complete. The stars outside were stable, but Magneto's senses still traced faint threads tugging toward the coordinates of the breach. The door had reopened once. A predator had come through. That sequence suggested a corridor, not an accident. Someone or something had tested this universe's defenses and now knew exactly what lived here to resist it. The idea settled into him with calm certainty. The next threat would not be mindless hunger. It would be intention. Picard gave the order to hold position long enough for Data to analyze the anomaly's residue. Magneto did not object. Analysis was the Federation's instinct, and the instinct had earned his respect tonight. Still, somewhere beneath that respect, a colder awareness remained. If the rift had been cut deliberately, then the hand holding the knife had not yet shown itself. The bridge quieted into watchfulness. The Enterprise drifted in the wake of crisis, and Magneto stood within that silence like a weathered monument, feeling the future press closer with each fading second, handing the story onward into questions no one yet dared to speak aloud. The analysis began with numbers, as Starfleet analysis always did. Data reconstructed the Predator's magnetic signature layer by layer, filtering out the Enterprise's own harmonics, subtracting natural electromagnetic noise, isolating what belonged to the breach alone. Magneto watched the process in stillness, but his mind moved loudly beneath the calm. The ship's computers might translate the anomaly into graphs, yet Magneto had learned that patterns of violence can be read without instruments. Hunger left footprints, intent left scars. When Data's preliminary model arrived on the main screen, the bridge grew quieter. The Predator's core lattice was mapped as a rotating field structure, but what stood out was not the geometry itself. It was the origin signature embedded in the lattice like a fingerprint. The field did not match any known Federation technology. It did not match Romulan disruptor systems, Klingon power coils, or Cardassian subspace capacitors. It was older in its physics, stranger in its rhythm, and yet familiar in a way that made Magneto's chest tighten. He felt it too. The residue in space around them carried a chirality, a subtle twist in the electromagnetic spectrum that resonated with the moment of his own abduction through the rift. Not identical, but adjacent, like two blades forged in the same fire, then bent toward different purposes. The Predator had not merely found a crack. It had been guided through one. That guidance was braided into its lattice as a tuning key. Magneto stepped closer to the view screen without thinking. The fragments drifting outside were inert now, but their molecules still remembered the field that had held them together. His awareness brushed those molecules across distance and brought back an echo. The echo was not a voice, not a thought, but a kind of magnetic intention that moved like a hunter tracing a trail. It had been searching for power sources, yes, but more than that, it had been searching for alignment. It had needed a world soaked in high-energy electromagnetism to open wider. The Enterprise had been a feast, but also a signal flare. The realization hit like cold metal settling in the palm. This universe was vulnerable because of its progress. Warp fields, transporters, deflector pulses, antimatter reactors, all of it created microfractures in dimensional membranes, individually harmless, collectively over centuries a weakening. Magneto had seen this kind of irony before. The more humanity advanced, the more it built the tools of its own peril. Here, the Federation had not merely invented engines. It had unknowingly worn down reality's walls with each leap forward. He did not need to ask if that was true. His senses felt the weakening like stress lines in a blade that had been used too long. The breach was not random. It was a symptom of accumulated strain, and the Predator was not the architect. It was the scavenger arriving when the walls grew thin. Picard watched Magneto's posture shift, sensed the gravity of what he was seeing. The captain asked quietly what he felt. Magneto answered with controlled clarity. The rift was not a single event. It was part of a larger failure in dimensional stability. The Predator belonged to a class of entities that used electromagnetic corridors to cross realities. If one had arrived, more could follow. The breach point might reopen elsewhere, wherever a warp core or power grid sang loud enough to be heard across membranes of world. The bridge absorbed that truth with slow dread. Data confirmed it through probability layers. If microfractures exist at scale, their distribution would cluster around high-energy installations, warp lanes, starbases, industrial world networks. The Predator's targeting had been too precise to be instinct alone. Something had calibrated it to the Federation's technological heartbeat. Magneto felt the weight of responsibility deepen. In his own life, he had fought governments and men. This was different. This was the universe itself becoming porous under the pressure of its own progress. A war not against hatred, but against hunger that traveled on the same currents as civilization. Picard's voice came soft and steady, acknowledging the danger without surrendering to it. If this was part of a broader pattern, then Starfleet would respond as it always had, with investigation, cooperation, and the refusal to be ruled by fear. Magneto respected the resolve, yet beneath it felt the old question rising. When a wall is already cracking, resolves must become action before ideals become epitaphs. The stars outside remained still, but the future had shifted. Magneto stood at the center of that shift, understanding that his arrival was not merely displacement. It was the first warning of a multiversal pressure building toward collapse. The story moved onward into the next movement, where that warning would be tested against Starfleet's most sacred ethics. The Enterprise changed course under careful impulse, not toward home, but toward a nearby system flagged by long-range scans. Data's model had revealed a pattern, and patterns demanded verification. In the Stellar Cartography Lab, the story translated itself into a three-dimensional ocean of stars, each point tagged with energy density, warp traffic, industrial flux. One world pulsed in amber among the map, modest in technology, yet surrounded by a growing electromagnetic haze that should not have been there. Magneto stood beside the holographic display, eyes narrowed as the planet came into focus. A pre-warp civilization, early 21st century equivalent, cities glittering with power grids, satellites tracing silent arcs, nuclear reactors humming beneath continents. The kind of world he recognized instantly because he had lived through its fear and violence. Yet here it was innocent of the Federation's wars, still stumbling through its own adolescence without knowing that predators listened beyond the sky. Tashin, the Vulcan science officer, delivered the report with crisp logic. An anomalous magnetic storm was rising in orbit, mirroring the same inversion residue detected at the Enterprise breach. If the pattern held, a new rift would open within 48 hours, drawn by the planet's growing electromagnetic output. The storm itself was already destabilizing weather, communications, and power distribution across the surface. If a predator arrived, it would feed on the world's grids, and life would collapse into chaos within days. Magneto felt the planet's metal infrastructure as if it were a nerve in his own body. Power lines thick as veins, rail systems threading continents, machines everywhere, an orchestra of iron that made him ache with a familiar protectiveness. The people below were not his people, not from his history, yet the texture of their civilization matched the ones he had sworn to defend. Their homes would burn if the rift opened. Their governments would panic. Their fear would find scapegoats because fear always did. Picard's posture remained calm, yet magnetism in the room rose with unseen tension. The Prime Directive hovered silently between captain and guest. Starfleet policy forbade interference, even to prevent catastrophe, if the interference would alter the natural development of a pre-warp society. The law was not written in cruelty, but in the scar tissue of history. Yet seeing it in practice always felt different than reading it in a code. Magneto turned toward Picard slowly, voice steady and low. This was not a philosophical problem in a lecture hall. This was a world about to be eaten by a rupture the Federation could anticipate and prevent. A tractor beam could redirect the orbital storm. The deflector could disperse the inversion field. A discrete intervention could stabilize the atmosphere without revealing Starfleet. The kind of surgical act that saved lives without becoming a god. Picard met the gaze without flinching. The captain explained the directive with patience, but Magneto had already understood it. He had lived inside systems that called inaction principle. He had watched leaders stand on moral law while bodies piled up because law was cleaner than consequence. The conflict rose in him, not as rage, but as a slow volcanic pressure. He argued not from defiance, but from moral arithmetic shaped by survival. If a predator was coming, letting the planet face it unaided was not respecting destiny. It was sentencing an entire civilization to death for the sake of maintaining Starfleet purity. The Federation had the power and the knowledge now. Refusing to act was a choice, and every choice carried blood. Tashin countered with Vulcan clarity about contamination. The people would search for causes, detect anomalies, perhaps glimpse alien intervention, and their science and religion would warp under the revelation. Their path would no longer belong solely to them. Picard added the deeper concern that even well-hidden rescue creates dependency in the long arc, a subtle shaping of growth that cannot be undone. Magneto listened and felt the weight of their experience, yet the lines still cut him. In his universe, dependence had not been the enemy, extinction had. He had built his life around stopping extinction, and the instinct did not bow easily to policy, no matter how noble its origin. The lab held the clash in solemn quiet. Two ethical systems pressed against each other without breaking into violence. Magneto looked back at the glowing planet, imagining cities swallowed by darkness, children learning fear in firelight, and felt the old vow tighten in his chest. Never again meant nothing if it only applied to one universe. He did not move to act yet. The decision was forming, but it would require more than power. It would require choosing whether to honor Starfleet law as guest or to honor the way his own history had shaped him. The story flowed onward softly toward that choice, because the storm above the pre-warp world was already thickening, and time was no longer a neutral observer. The debate did not belong to anger. It belonged to two men who had carried too many graves inside them, each grave shaping a different compass. In the quiet chamber, Magneto stood with the planet's hologram casting pale light across his face, and Picard stood opposite with the posture of a captain who had watched civilizations rise and fall and still believed restraint could be mercy. The air between them was not hostile, but it was heavy, like the space before thunder. Magneto spoke first, voice calm but edged with something older than this ship. He did not insult Starfleet, did not mock the Federation's ethics. He named the consequence plainly. A rift was forming. A predator like the one they had fought would come because the planet's electromagnetic output made it a beacon. If Starfleet did nothing, millions would die in collapse, perhaps extinction. Refusing to act was not neutrality. It was choosing death as the preferred moral outcome. Picard listened without interruption. There was no dismissal in the captain's expression, only the fatigue of a law that still hurt to carry. When he answered, the words came steady and low, framed by command but softened by sincerity. The prime directive existed because intervention, even hidden intervention, had historically broken societies. People who survive because a higher power discreetly bends nature lose something essential: the chance to confront their own fate, to develop their own solutions, to rise on their own legs rather than leaning on unseen hands. The Federation had once been the savior that ruined worlds. The directive was the scar that prevented repeating that sin. Magneto felt the truth in the captain's history. A man does not say such things lightly without having lived their cost. Yet reason did not dissolve the rage that consequence summoned. He had seen worlds ruined by inaction as surely as by interference. His earliest memories were of people who believed the line was non-interference, right up to the moment trains arrived, and lines became rails. He responded with controlled clarity. Autonomy matters, but autonomy is a hollow word when a civilization is wiped from existence by a threat they have no way to understand. There is no future to preserve if they die before reaching it. If Starfleet could prevent the rift without revealing itself, then it could protect both life and autonomy. The insistence that no action is cleaner than discrete action was a moral illusion. Picard's gaze held firm. The captain acknowledged the appeal of the third path, yet warned that no intervention remains truly invisible. Ripples spread. A rescue here changes a scientific discovery there, shifts a cultural story elsewhere, and the world develops under a shadow it never consented to. The line might feel cruel, but without a line, Starfleet becomes judge over which worlds live and which do not, and that authority, however well-intended, becomes tyranny by accumulation. Magneto heard the word tyranny and felt the old reflex stir. He had been called tyrant by those who hunted children for their genes. He had been called monster by governments that built monsters in their own image. His jaw tightened, not in insult, but in pain that had learned to hide. He did not raise his voice. He simply returned to arithmetic, a directive that forces one to watch extinction, while possessing the means to stop it is not a safeguard, it is a failure of responsibility. Troy moved gently into the tension, her presence a soft cloth laid over a blade. She named what both men carried, fear of repeating history. Picard feared becoming the savior who destroys futures. Magneto feared becoming the observer who permits genocide by silence. Both fears were valid. Neither could be erased by argument alone. Tashin added that the debate had no objective answer, only competing moral systems. The Vulcan logic did not soothe Magneto. Logic without compassion had always been a counterfeit comfort in his life, yet he respected the clarity. At least this crew did not pretend the choice was easy. Magneto looked again at the planet, feeling its iron heartbeat through space. Millions of lives balanced on law and conscience. The storm in orbit was thickening by the hour. The rift would open whether Starfleet debated or not. That inevitability pressed into his chest with calm certainty. He turned back to Picard and let the final statement settle in without threat. He would not seize command of the Enterprise. He had honored the captain's authority during crisis, but he could not promise to honor a law he found morally unbearable if it meant letting another world burn. The choice was not rebellion. The choice was the test of who he was, no matter the century. Picard did not answer with force. The captain simply held the gaze, recognizing the dangerous sincerity there. In that mutual recognition, something shifted, not toward agreement, but toward the understanding that the universe was forcing both lines closer to collision. The room fell into solemn quiet. The storm above the pre-warp world continued to rise, and the story moved softly forward into the moment when argument would be replaced by action, and the consequences of whichever line bent first would echo across this alternate universe. Action arrived not from Magneto's hands, but from the universe's cruel timing. Before any decision could harden, alarms rippled through the Enterprise's internal net. A new surge of electromagnetic distortion flared at the breach coordinates, far enough away to suggest a second opening, close enough to feel like the same wound stretching wider. The pre-warp world remained in danger, but now the Enterprise itself faced another pull on its attention. The captain ordered the ship to hold position while tracking the new signal. The debate had been suspended, not resolved, and suspended debates tend to leave sharp edges. Magneto left stellar cartography in quiet focus, moving through corridors that hummed with a future he still could not claim as home. The ship's metal spoke to him everywhere, whispering of stability, of systems returning to normal, of the deflector dish still warm from resonance. He felt the Enterprise's trust hovering around him like a fragile halo, a trust built quickly in crisis but not yet tested in peace. Trust like that can be precious and also dangerous, because those who offer it often do not understand how many will try to steal it. When the lift doors opened to his assigned quarters, the air inside felt wrong. Not hostile, not visibly disturbed, just subtly misaligned. The magnetic field in the room carried a foreign thread, as if another presence had stepped through and tried to scrub away its footprints. Magneto froze in the doorway, awareness widening. Every screw, every lattice line in the walls, every seam in the deck responded in his mind. There was a new geometry pressed into them, a pattern shaped by someone who knew enough to hide, but not enough to erase the echo completely. He stepped inside cautiously. The lights were as he had left them. His few replicated belongings sat in place, yet the room had been entered. The air held a residue of intent sharpened toward acquisition. A small metal shard rested on the table where he had not placed it. Alien alloy, thin as a coin, etched with spectral grooves that caught the light in unpleasant ways. Magneto lifted it with a thought and felt its origin signature snap against his senses like cold wire. Romulan, Tal Shire, not a random intrusion, but a deliberate one. The realization landed hard, because it meant the Enterprise was already being watched. His arrival had not stayed confined to one ship. Power always leaks into rumor, and rumor always reaches the hands that want to weaponize it. The door chimed. Before he could answer, it slid open under authority codes, and Worf entered with two security officers. Their posture was tense, not accusatory yet, but close to it. Worf's voice came calm and low. An unauthorized access event was detected near your quarters. We are here to escort you to the bridge. Magneto did not resist. He had submitted to Picard's command during the Predator attack. He would not fracture the fragile alliance now with suspicion alone. Still, some quieter part of him noted the pattern. In his world, security teams did not come early unless fear had already started to grow. On the bridge, Data reported the breach signal had been accompanied by a cloaked vessel signature, briefly detected at the edge of sensor range. Romulan field distortion consistent with a warbird. The vessel had vanished again before a full lock could be achieved. Picard's jaw tightened, not with anger, but with the weary knowledge of how quickly diplomacy can turn into chess. The captain turned toward Magneto with calm authority. Romulan forces appear to be monitoring the anomaly and your presence. We have no confirmation of hostile intent, but we cannot ignore the possibility that they will attempt to acquire you or your knowledge of electromagnetic manipulation. Acquire, the word stung in Magneto's chest, because he had heard it too many times in other languages. Humans had tried to acquire mutants for experiments. Governments had tried to acquire him for leverage. Empires always spoke the same vocabulary when they saw power in another being. He answered steadily. The shard in his quarters proved they had already tried. The attempt had been covert, not diplomatic. If they were willing to violate Enterprise security now, they would be willing to violate Federation borders later. Picard absorbed that with a quiet tightening of his own resolve. The Enterprise could handle external threats, but internal fractures of trust were harder. The captain did not blame Magneto for being targeted, yet the ship's crew, watching from consoles, felt the shadow this brought. They had taken an unknown guest under protection, and now that guest had drawn the eyes of an old enemy. Magneto felt that shadow too, not because he wanted it, but because he had lived his life inside it. The Federation was noble, but nobility does not stop empires from hunting what they want. Outside, the stars stayed cold. Inside, trust trembled under the pressure of interception and espionage. Magneto stood in the center of that tremor, realizing that saving a pre-warp world was no longer the only test ahead. Cooperation itself was being targeted. The story moved softly forward into the next crisis, where Romulan ambition, dimensional instability, and Magneto's presence would collide, and the future would demand a choice sharper than any debate. The Valdor did not decloak with a roar or a flourish. It slipped out of subspace like a blade, emerging from shadow, massive, green-gray hull catching starlight in angles designed to intimidate. The Enterprise's bridge tightened around the site, red alert returning in a muted rhythm, but Magneto felt the change before the view screen finished resolving the shape. Cloaked ships carried a specific kind of magnetic hush, a quiet inversion that made the air feel thin and wrong, and this one radiated discipline, the Tal Shire's signature of patient predation. Picard stood at the command rail, posture steady, voice calm as the hail came through. A Romulan commander introduced herself with courteous menace, requesting discussion about the unusual passenger aboard the Federation flagship. The words were clean, diplomatic on the surface, but Magneto heard the hunger beneath them. Empires always mask desire in language of interest and security. The captain replied with Federation clarity. Magneto was a guest under protection, not a commodity for negotiation. Any inquiry would proceed through proper diplomatic channels. The Romulan voice answered with an amused softness, implying that channels were luxuries reserved for those without urgency. Their sensors had detected the breach. They had observed the predator. They had observed the way Magneto reshaped a dimensional magnetic lattice with will alone. Such capability, she said, could alter the balance of power across the quadrant. It belonged in Romulan hands for the stability of the galaxy. Magneto stood slightly behind Picard, cape still, gaze fixed on the warbird. The argument was old, older than this century. Stability always meant submission. Safety always meant control. Hearing it in a future that claimed enlightenment felt like watching history repeat itself under a new flag. Data's hands moved across his console, trying to pin the warbird's field distortions, but the cloak remained partial. Worf recommended a hard posture, shield lock, weapons charged but not fired. The bridge balanced on that razor edge between diplomacy and the first spark of war. Magneto's senses traced the Valdor's hull, reading its metal like an open book. It was a fortress of layered alloys and microfields, prepared for battle, prepared for capture. And through its electromagnetic signature, something else flickered, faint but sharp enough to snag attention. Fear. Not the fear of confrontation with the Enterprise, but the deeper, bone-level fear of a civilization staring at a wound they could not close. That contradiction unsettled him. Tal Shire operations did not run on fear unless fear had been welded into their mission. A Romulan commander willing to violate Federation space, willing to risk diplomatic crisis for one displaced mutant, was not acting on ambition alone. She was acting on desperation disguised as strategy. Before Picard could press further, the warbird's shield surged to maximum. A transporter lock attempted to breach Enterprise defenses, subtle and precise, riding the same electromagnetic spectrum that the earlier Predator had used. The security net flared. Data shouted a warning. Worf's tactical display screamed of unauthorized transport in progress. Magneto felt the beam's touch, a cold unraveling across skin and bone, not unlike the breach that had pulled him from his own reality. For a heartbeat, the bridge stretched into light, and then the Enterprise vanished. Reconstitution came in a gray containment chamber whose air tasted like damp metal. Romulan technology lined the walls in layered coils tuned to disrupt electromagnetic control. Clever dampeners, not enough to erase his power entirely, but enough to make every act of magnetism feel like pushing through mud. Beyond the transparent barrier stood the commander from the hail, younger than her voice suggested, uniform crisp, eyes sharp with exhaustion she could not hide. She did not gloat. Gloating would have been easy. Instead, her composure cracked at the edges, showing the strain beneath. She apologized once, briefly, not for kidnapping him, but for waiting this long to do it. Time was short, she said, and Starfleet's principles would have delayed what she needed. Magneto listened in stillness, feeling the containment field's shape, tasting desperation in the room like iron in the air. The warbird's engines vibrated softly underfoot, already turning away toward Romulan space. The Enterprise's red alert sirens were now distant echoes in his memory. Trust had been breached, and the universe had tightened its hand around him again. Yet desperation remained the key. If Romulus wanted him badly enough to steal him, then Romulus was bleeding in a way the Federation did not yet see. Magneto held that thought without panic, letting it settle into calm certainty, because in his life, true threats always arrived wearing masks of ambition. The story carried forward softly into the reason behind the abduction, where Romulan fear would become visible, and the nature of the dimensional crisis would widen beyond the Enterprise alone. The containment chamber's lights were subdued, practical, designed for interrogation without dramatics. Magneto stood within the field's shimmer, not pacing, not posturing, letting stillness do its work. The dampeners in the walls tugged at the electromagnetic air like hands trying to blind him. They softened his reach, muffled his senses, but they did not cut them. The iron around him still spoke, even through Romulan tricks. Commander Sella watched from behind the barrier, and Magneto watched back. Under her controlled military bearing, a fracture showed, not weakness exactly, but urgency deep enough to bruise discipline. This was not a woman playing a political game from comfort. This was a commander who had already lost sleep to something she could not stop. Magneto spoke first, voice steady and low. If the Empire wanted a weapon, it had chosen poorly. No empire held him in chains without spilling blood. The words were not a threat, only a boundary. The iron in his history did not melt for uniforms. Sella's face tightened, then softened with something like grim honesty. She did not want him as a weapon. She wanted him as a surgeon. The choice to abduct had been born from time collapsing, not ambition expanding. Romulus was dying. She activated a holographic display. The image projected a familiar wrongness, a scar beneath a planet's crust rendered in shifting electromagnetic color. A dimensional fracture, she said, growing for months, feeding on the magnetic stress created by Romulan quantum singularity cores. Their scientists could not slow it. Their technology could not speak the language of the wound. Within weeks, perhaps less, Romulus and Remus would be erased into a void that did not merely kill, but unmade. Magneto's senses brushed the holographic data and recoiled. The signature was kin to the breach that had pulled him here. Same spectral twist, same inversion harmonic, the same taste of reality thinning into an edge sharp enough to cut universes. The predator at the Enterprise had been a scavenger. This fracture was an axe lodged in the roots of a world. Sella's voice broke once, barely audible. 6 billion lives stood on that timeline, her daughter among them. The Senate did not know. Starfleet did not know. Panic would collapse the Empire long before the Void did, so secrecy had been their last defense. She had searched for any solution that could cross this gap, any being who could read magnetic wounds the way Magneto did. When the Enterprise fought the Predator, she watched. When Magneto rewrote a dimensional magnetic lattice with his will, she recognized the only door left open. The chamber held her confession in solemn quiet. Magneto did not move. His mind moved fiercely beneath the calm. Romulus was a warp-capable empire, not protected by the Prime Directive in the same way as a pre-warp world, yet the ethical weight remained. Saving Romulus meant intervening in the future of a civilization that had often stood against everything the Federation valued. It meant choosing to save enemies, then living with the consequences of that mercy. In his own universe, that kind of choice had never been simple. Still, 6 billion were not a political problem. They were lives, families, children who would never have a chance to become anything but echoes if the wound opened fully. Magneto felt the arithmetic settle into him with calm certainty. This was not a debate about cultural contamination. This was a fight against hunger wearing the mask of physics. He asked why she had not gone to Picard. The Federation would aid a humanitarian crisis, even for Romulans. Sella's answer came bitter but controlled. Starfleet would debate, demand treaties, require committees. Their ethics moved slowly on purpose. Weeks of diplomacy were luxuries the fracture did not grant. She had needed a response measured in hours, not policy cycles. Magneto absorbed that without dismissing it. He understood impatience with idealism that moved too slowly to save anyone. He also understood the danger of choosing unilateral action and calling it necessity. The paradox sat in his chest like a second heartbeat. Romulan fear was real, and Romulan methods were brutal. Both could be true at once. Sella watched him through the barrier as if waiting for a verdict from the only judge left. Magneto felt the dampeners tug again, felt the Warbird's engines turning toward Romulus, toward the wound. The choice was arriving whether he wanted it or not. He did not give a final answer yet, not because he was undecided, but because a surgeon needs to see the wound with his own senses before cutting. Stillness returned, but it was the stillness of a blade hovering above skin, ready. The story flowed forward softly, toward Romulus itself, where the fracture would become visible not as data, but as a living scar demanding a response no civilization could delay. Orbit above Romulus carried the hush of a world holding its breath. The Valdor slid into position with Romulan efficiency, the planet filling the view screen in a sweep of cobalt oceans and dark continents veined with city lights. Magneto stood on the Warbird's bridge now, released from containment under careful watch, because secrecy no longer mattered in the face of a wound this close to breaking. Romulan officers moved around him in tight, controlled silence. Their fear had become function. The fracture was visible even before sensors translated it. A writhing scar in the planet's southern hemisphere, a region where clouds spiraled unnaturally around a cratered wake that glowed with colors the human eye should not accept. It was not fire, not aurora, not volcanic flare. It was space itself bleeding through stone, reality thinning, until the fabric underneath showed. Magneto felt it along the electromagnetic spectrum like a scream. His awareness reached down through atmosphere and crust, through iron-rich mantle and humming singularity cores. The scar was not merely magnetic disturbance. It was dimensional pressure braided into magnetism, gnawing at the borders between frames of existence. The Romulan reactors below were feeding it like blood into a cut, not by intention, but by the simple physics of their technology. Each quantum core pulled on gravity in ways that rippled sideways into dimensions their science did not yet measure. Magneto's mind calculated timelines with surgical coldness. The fracture was accelerating. It did not have weeks. It had days, perhaps less. The signature matched the Enterprise breach, but stronger, deeper, more deliberately sustained. This was not a random stress failure. This was an attack, and the attacker was using Romulan technology as the blade. A Tal Shire scientist confirmed reports of the Enterprise pursuing across the neutral zone. Picard demanded Magneto's return. The Romulans bristled, old reflexes tightening toward secrecy. Magneto stepped forward into that tension, cape still, voice steady and low. Tell him the truth. Secrecy here was theater while the stage burned. Sella hesitated with the instincts of a commander raised on espionage. Yet the scar below pulsed again, and her discipline yielded to survival. A channel opened. The Enterprise appeared on the main screen, Picard's face composed, eyes hardening as sensor data from Romulus streamed into his awareness. The Federation captain absorbed the truth without flinching. No moral lecture came first. Only the swift recalibration of a leader who understood that existential threats erase politics before they erase worlds. Picard requested to beam over with Data and Geordi, not as invaders, but as collaborators. Sella granted it, because refusal would now be suicide dressed as pride. They materialized on the Valdor's bridge amid strained stillness. The Federation and the Romulan Empire facing the same wound in the same moment. Magneto watched Picard's eyes register the scar below, watched the captain's jaw tighten with the same horror any defender of life feels when reality itself becomes a weapon. he noted the subtle shift in Picard's posture, the one that signaled principle bending toward necessity without breaking. Data and Geordi began overlaying Federation sensor models with Romulan data. Their holograms filled the bridge like a storm of science, yet even those models could not capture what Magneto sensed. The fracture was not a hole. It was a door held open from the far side. Something beyond was feeding on electromagnetic corridors, pushing upward like pressure behind a dam. Magneto explained what his senses read in controlled precision. The predator they had fought was a tool, a scout. This was the architecture of a larger hunger, one that targeted high-energy civilizations to widen the multiverse's seams. Romulus was first because singularity cores made a louder beacon. Federation space would follow, because warp lanes and deflector arrays sang on the same spectrum. Picard listened, then looked to Magneto with calm authority. If stopping the fracture required entering it, Starfleet would support the attempt. Not because it was safe, but because it was necessary. The Romulans nodded, secrecy fading into the raw urgency of survival. Magneto stared down at the scar, feeling its magnetic pulse match the rhythm of his own breath. A lifetime of fighting for mutants against human fear had not prepared him for this, a mankind of stars creating its own destroyer through progress. Yet the instinct remained the same: protect life from extinction, even when the enemy is the universe's own hunger. The story moved softly onward into the plan that formed in that orbiting war room, where science and Magneto's power would again need to merge, but this time with stakes measured in billions and a door that might close behind him forever. The orbiting bridge became a chamber of reluctant unity. Federation uniforms stood beside Romulan gray, old enemies forced into cooperation not by treaties, but by the simple fact that reality did not care who owned which border. Magneto stood at the center of their shared attention, feeling the fractures pull through the planet beneath them. Its electromagnetic cadence rose like a heartbeat that belonged to no living thing. Each pulse was a step closer to erasure. Data's analysis unfolded in clean layers. The fracture's growth curve was exponential, not random. It was being fed from below by the singularity cores, and from above by a dimensional pressure source pushing through. If a seal was attempted from orbit alone, the door would resist, splintering subspace and potentially ripping open wider elsewhere. Geordi supported the conclusion with engineering constraints. Their technology could shape fields, but it could not reach through the door far enough to turn off the hand pushing from the other side. Magneto listened, then translated the truth through his own senses. A seal from this side would be a bandage placed while the wound was still being cut. The source of the attack was on the far side. To stop it, someone had to go in, confront whatever was feeding the fracture, and force it back. Only then could a seal hold. The words came steady and low, not dramatic. This was not sacrifice theater. This was surgery. Picard objected with a captain's instinct to protect life, even when the life belonged to a guest who had arrived by accident. Entering an unstable dimensional rift with no guarantee of extraction was close to suicide. Starfleet did not throw lives into holes without exhausting alternatives, yet alternatives had already thinned to dust. Sella, sharp with Romulan pragmatism, acknowledged the risk without softening it. If Magneto refused, Romulus died. If he entered and failed, Romulus still died, and perhaps sectors beyond died too. The edge of choice had narrowed to one path. Magneto felt the weight settle in, familiar in shape even in an alien century. Save billions, risk one life, his life. In his universe, he had made such calculations with clenched teeth and blood on his hands. This time, the calculation carried a different bitterness. It was not choosing between competing lives. It was choosing whether to allow erasure by policy or to gamble on intervention. He agreed, but with conditions that shaped cooperation rather than martyrdom. The Enterprise in Valdor would maintain constant tracking of his electromagnetic signature. Data would lock transporters to the frequency of his field, not for normal beaming, but for emergency extraction if the door began to collapse behind him. Geordi would keep the deflector dish tuned as an amplifier, ready to pour stabilizing resonance through the fracture if his work inside needed support. Romulan engineers would reroute Singularity Core output downward, throttling the lure that fed the wound. The plan was audacious, stitched from two sciences that did not fully trust each other and one mutant power that had never faced a dimensional door like this. Yet it was honest in its pragmatism. It used what existed, not what they wished existed. Picard pulled Magneto aside briefly as the others prepared the transporter modifications. The captain's voice was low, carrying the weight of a man who understood sacrifice only too well. Magneto owed them nothing. He had been dragged into this universe. He could walk away from Romulan politics and Federation ethics alike. Why risk himself for an empire that had stolen him minutes earlier? Magneto met the question without flinching. Because the people below were not politics, because lives mattered regardless of banners, because if the Federation's ideals meant anything, they meant saving life when the universe tried to erase it, and because a man who had spent his life saying never again could not let another world burn while holding the means to stop it. Picard's gaze softened with a quiet respect that felt like a hand placed on the shoulder of a fellow burden-bearer. He did not argue further. He simply promised support, and that promise was made not as an order, but as an equal's vow. Magneto returned to the transporter room aboard the Valdor. The pad waited, outlined in pale light. The hum beneath it carried the hybrid resonance data, and Geordi had crafted an electromagnetic song tuned to his field. His cape settled around him like an old companion. The fracture below pulsed again, as if impatient. The story handed forward softly into the moment of descent, where Magneto would step into the wound itself, leaving orbit and certainty behind, and entering a space where magnetism would be his only language against a hunger older than any empire. Transport broke him into light, stitched him into air, and dropped him onto Romulus's surface with a force that was not physical but existential. The world reassembled around him in a barren crater mile wide, the sky above bruised by storm clouds twisting in unnatural spirals. The fracture loomed ahead like a scar cut into the planet's skin, a canyon of shifting electromagnetic color and dimensional vapor. It was not merely a hole. It was a threshold through which the wrongness of another reality seeped. Magneto steadied himself, boots sinking slightly into scorched soil. The air tasted metallic, charged with inversion harmonics that made his senses ache. Iron in the ground trembled toward the wound as if pulled by distant gravity. Every compass of electromagnetism in his mind pointed to the fracture the way instinct points toward danger. The tracking link to orbit remained faint but present. Data's calm voice reached him through the comm, spiraling along the frequency they had bound to his field. Lock established, Dr. Lehnsherr, signature stable across multiple bands. If extraction becomes necessary, signal immediately. The words carried warmth disguised as technical precision. Magneto accepted it in silence, grateful for the anchor. He approached the edge. The fracture's interior was a shifting geometry that did not obey perspective. Colors that belonged to no spectrum moved through it, and the electromagnetic field inside was simultaneously vast and focused, like a storm that had learned to aim. Magneto extended his awareness downward, probing the wound like a hand in dark water. Something immense moved beneath. Not a living mind in the way he understood life, but a pressure, a coherence that carried appetite without malice. The predator they had fought had been a scout. This was the source, a dimensional organism born from electromagnetic corridors, feeding on the technological heartbeat of star-spanning civilizations. It was climbing toward the door because it had finally found a feast large enough to justify the effort. Magneto bent his knees slightly, letting the planet's iron rise in slow orbit around him. Metallic dust, shards of Romulan alloy, fragments of dormant machines, all lifting into disciplined formation. He shaped a magnetic field around his body, a sheath to hold his coherence when the rules of space failed. The act was not heroic pageantry. It was preparation the way a diver checks oxygen before descending into black. He stepped into the fracture. Reality fractured around him like glass trying to remember it was whole. There was no up, no down, only gradients of electromagnetic pressure and dimensional shear. His body stretched across planes that would have torn a normal organism apart, but the field around him held his atoms in a coherent map. Magnetism was his spine now, his breath his compass. The void between dimensions felt cold and crowded. Threads of warp lanes, quantum reaction echoes, transporter residue, all converging through the door like rivers meeting a sea. This was where progress had pooled its side effects for centuries, a hidden landfill of microfractures that something hungry had finally learned to navigate. The entity rose toward him, not with claws or jaws, but with the swelling of an ocean under moonlight. It was a shape of shifting metallic darkness and electromagnetic lattice, vast enough to make starships feel like crumbs. Its field pressed against his own and tasted him, not emotionally, not cruelly, only as a predator tests prey. Understanding passed between them in a way words could not. It knew him as an unusual concentration of magnetic will, a being who could perceive and manipulate the same currents it used to feed. To it, that awareness was rare, interesting, perhaps edible in a different way. Magneto did not panic. Panic was a luxury he had burned out of his system long ago. He addressed it through force and intention. The words came under his breath, steady and low, meant less as speech than as the shaping of his will. This door closes today. This world is not yours to consume. He extended his field outward in braided bands, not to crush, but to bind. Magnetic chains of pressure wrapped across dimensional planes, seeking to hold the entity's lattice in stasis. The creature pushed back, and the collision of fields sent shock ripples across the void. Somewhere above, orbiting sensors screamed as the fracture flared. Magneto held, not because he believed brute binding would be enough, but because the first step in any battle is to stop the enemy's forward motion long enough to read its nature. He felt its hunger, felt its corridors, felt the way it had been drawn by warp and singularity songs, and understood with a chill that this was not a singular threat. It was a symptom of a multiverse exhausted by its own technological noise. The void trembled, the door behind him pulsed as if ready to lock. Data's voice remained a faint tether. The entity pressed forward again, testing the chains. Magneto tightened his field and prepared for the deeper work, knowing that survival now depended not only on strength, but on whether a man shaped by war could find another path through hunger before this wound swallowed a world. The story flowed onward softly, into the confrontation where magnetism would meet appetite at cosmic scale, and the outcome would decide whether Romulus remained a planet or became a footnote erased from existence. Transport broke him into light, stitched him into air, and dropped him onto Romulus with a force that was not physical but existential. The world reassembled around a barren crater, miles wide, the sky bruised by storm clouds twisting in patterns no atmosphere should hold. Ahead, the fracture writhed like a living scar, a canyon of shifting electromagnetic color and dimensional vapor. It was not a hole in ground, it was a threshold in reality, and every pulse of it carried a promise of erasure. Magneto steadied in scorched soil, boots sinking into ash that had tasted too much fear already. The air was heavy with inversion harmonics that made the iron in his blood feel like it was being called by a distant tide. Beneath the surface, Romulan singularity cores thrummed like buried hearts, each beat feeding the wound. Above him, orbiting ships held a careful vigil, their technology tuned to his electromagnetic signature like a lifeline thrown into deep water. Data's voice reached down through the comm, faint but present, riding the frequency grafted to Magneto's field. Lock remained stable across multiple bands, extraction ready if required. The words were shaped like science, yet carried something softer, a calm faith that a man of power could still return to those who had placed trust in him. Magneto accepted the tether without reply, letting it settle into his awareness the way a climber feels a rope tighten around a waist. Approaching the edge, his senses drifted inward. The fracture's interior warped perspective, color sliding beyond visible spectrum, geometry folding as if space had forgotten its own rules. The electromagnetic field inside was vast, but also focused, like a storm that had learned to aim. Magneto extended his awareness downward, probing like a hand in dark water, and felt something immense moving beneath the crust of existence. Not a mind in the human sense, not a villain with intent, but a coherent appetite stitched into magnetism. An entity born from the long, slow weakening of dimensional membranes, drawn to the songs of warp fields and singularity engines, the way predators follow blood sent through night. The creature was climbing because it had finally found a feast loud enough to justify the passage. Metal rose around Magneto in slow orbit. Dust, shards of Romulan alloy, fragments of abandoned machine, all circling with disciplined grace. A magnetic sheath formed around his body, not as armor in the theatrical sense, but as structure, holding his atoms together when rules of normal space failed. The act was quiet, surgical, the way a diver checks oxygen before descending into black. He stepped into the fracture. Reality tore sideways and folded again. There was no up, no down, only gradients of electromagnetic pressure and dimensional shear. His body stretched across planes that would have shredded a lesser organism, yet the field around him held coherence, magnetism becoming spine, breath, compass. In that void between realities, he sensed the detritus of centuries, microfractures from warp lanes, transporter echoes, quantum core ripples, all converging like rivers into a hidden sea. The Federation and the Romulan Empire had not meant to summon anything. Progress had simply left doors ajar often enough for hunger to learn the map. The entity rose toward him like a dark ocean lifting under moonlight. It was not fixed form, but a shifting lattice of obsidian mass and electromagnetic geometry, vast enough to make starships feel like crumbs. Its field pressed against his own, tasting, measuring. The contact carried no cruelty, only the indifferent curiosity of an apex presence encountering something unusual. Magneto did not panic. Panic was a luxury burned out of him long ago. His will shaped the words under his breath, steady and low, less speech than intention poured into the magnetic currents. This door closes today. This world is not yours to consume. Bands of force braided outward magnetic chains spanning multiple planes. They wrapped around the creature's lattice, seeking to halt its forward momentum. The creature pushed back. The collision of fields made the void tremble, sending shock ripples up through the fracture. Somewhere far above, sensors flared and alarms rose on two bridges. Yet Magneto held, not because brute binding would end the threat, but because the first duty in any battle is to stop the enemy long enough to understand it. The understanding came like cold iron settling in the palm. This thing was not an architect. It was a symptom. It had followed corridors cut by technology, exploiting weakness created by centuries of electromagnetic stress. If it fell, another would eventually follow so long as the barrier stayed thin. The larger danger was the multiverse itself fraying under accumulated strain, a sickness spreading through every civilization that traveled on subspace and bent gravity with singularities. The fracture in Romulus was only the deepest wound so far. Magneto tightened the chains so the entity's lattice could not surge forward, then shifted his approach. Power alone had always been his first language, but power without direction becomes an endless war. He had spent a lifetime learning that lesson too late, too often, and the void gave him no room to repeat it. Instead of crushing, he opened his senses outward, letting the entity feel what he felt. Not words, not persuasion, but a transmission through the electromagnetic spectrum, a map of perception. He showed it the difference between hunger and conscience as humans understood them. He showed it a world of cities not as food, but as memory, art, stubborn love. He let it touch the Federation's insistence on coexistence, the Romulan fear of extinction beneath pride, the simple truth that sentient life is not a flavor of energy, but a pattern worth preserving. The entity recoiled slightly, not in fear, but in confusion. Its appetite had never been asked to consider choice. It had followed corridors because that was what it was. Magneto offered it a different corridor. Across the plains he had brushed during his own forced displacement, he had sensed regions of wild electromagnetic abundance, uninhabited dimensional pockets where energy pooled without consciousness, stars made of field rather than matter, seas of radiation that no civilization called home, places where such a creature could feed without erasing minds. He opened a narrow channel to one of those pockets, shaping it like a door cut from magnetism itself, steadying its edges with focused will. The offer was not sentimental, it was pragmatic, a surgeon giving a body another organ to redirect a fatal appetite. Feed there, retreat from here, assist in sealing these membranes, and this universe continues. Refuse, and the chains become a cage that outlasts galaxies. The entity pressed against the offered corridor, testing it. The energy within was pure, unthreaded by thought or life. It lingered, then began to withdraw from Magneto's chains, not fleeing, but choosing a different path. Hunger shifted course the way a river shifts when a new channel opens. The forward pressure against Romulus eased. The fracture above stopped expanding, as if the hand on the far side had finally loosened its grip. Magneto felt the void quiet around them. With the entity retreating through the new channel, the moment for sealing arrived. He turned his attention back to the fracture's edges, sensing them as thin electromagnetic membranes frayed by stress. His will moved through those edges like a needle through torn cloth, not forcing them shut by brute pressure, but aligning their fields back into coherence, encouraging reality to remember its proper geometry. Above, Geordi's deflector resonance poured, stabilizing energy downward, and Romulan core output throttled into safer harmonics. Science and magnetism braided together into a seal neither universe could have achieved alone. The door began to close. Dimensional pressure rose as membranes knit. The void tightened around Magneto, and the tracking tether from orbit tugged sharp against his awareness. Data's extraction lock flared, a bright magnetized thread through collapsing space. Magneto gathered his field close, reached for that thread, and let the transporter's hybrid resonance catch him. The pull was violent and clean, tearing him back through planes that tried to fold shut behind him. For a heartbeat, he felt the multiverse as a single chord snapping into tune, and then Romulan air returned, heavy and real, the transporter pad solid beneath his knees. He collapsed once, cape pooling around him like a fallen banner, breath slow but present. Picard stood nearest, Romulan officers flanking, Data and Geordi close behind. Their faces carried no triumph, only the cautious relief of people who had watched reality sway and not fall. Romulus is safe, Magneto said quietly, voice rough from dimensional strain. The entity has retreated, the fracture is sealed. A silence followed, reverent, almost disbelieving. 6 billion lives had remained in existence because a man from another universe had stepped into their wound and offered hunger a different path. Sella closed her eyes as if rediscovering gravity. Picard let a breath go slow, the weight of command easing for the first time since the scar had appeared on his screen. Back in orbit, the Enterprise and the Valdor held position together, not as enemies, but as survivors of the same truth. The diplomatic aftermath would be complicated, Magneto knew that. Empires do not become friends overnight, yet something had shifted. Cooperation had not been a slogan today, it had been a lifeline. Days later, when the Enterprise turned back toward Federation space, Magneto stood in the observation lounge watching stars slide past at warp. The future was still not his home, but it had become his responsibility. Data's reports showed smaller fractures across multiple sectors, the same pattern repeating wherever technology sang too loudly into dimensional seams. The multiverse was fraying, and his arrival had not been random. It had been the first warning. Picard entered with the quiet steadiness of a captain who knew how to stand beside power without worshipping it. Starfleet Command had approved a new liaison role, a multiversal stability consultant. Advisory authority, full access, constant oversight. An enlightened civilization offering collaboration instead of chains. Magneto accepted in silence, feeling the strange, unfamiliar weight of being trusted by an institution rather than hunted by one. He was still the master of magnetism, still shaped by old wars and older grief, yet now placed among people who believed in restraint as strongly as he believed in survival. Outside, the stars remained indifferent and endless. Inside, a new alliance had formed on the edge of collapse. A man displaced across realities had found another way to defend life without becoming its tyrant. The multiverse was cracking, the next storms would come, but Magneto was no longer alone in facing them. The Enterprise sailed on, carrying science, diplomacy, and a mutant solemn will into the widening dark, and reality itself felt, for the first time in a long time, just slightly more guarded than before.